Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be unpacking a really fascinating strategic shift in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. Usually when we think about this conflict, our minds go straight to the trenches, right? The artillery, the actual front lines. But today, we're looking at something totally different, but honestly, just as critical. We're talking about massive e-commerce networks and supply chains humming along hundreds of miles away from the actual fighting. As you'll see, these everyday civilian logistics operations, they've fundamentally become military targets.
To really get a handle on this shift, we need to look at a pretty dramatic, inciting incident. Picture this. Deep inside the Moscow region, long-range drones managed to penetrate the airspace and strike a colossal warehouse. This place belonged to Wildberries, which is a major Russian online retailer. And the resulting scene, it was absolute chaos. We're talking collapsing walls, workers literally running for their lives into the parking lots, and this massive, suffocating plume of thick black smoke just swallowing the entire site. And this fire didn't just burn for a bit, it raged for hours. Because think about it, you've got millions of cardboard boxes, plastic packaging, stored goods. That whole infrastructure acted like giant kindling, feeding the blaze way faster than any emergency crews could ever hope to put it out.
Later on, satellite imagery actually confirmed that this first complex was pretty much completely destroyed. The roof caved in, there was extensive burn damage everywhere. But here's the thing, this wasn't just some isolated one-off event. Actually, on the exact same day as that first strike, another Wildberries warehouse all the way in the Tambov region got hit and suffered explosion and fire damage. Then, fast forward to July 20th. Follow-up strikes hit the logistics complex at Kolanino, which just so happens to be the company's single largest sorting center. And on that very same day, yet another major warehouse complex near Domodedovo went up in flames. So, putting all these pieces together paints a very clear picture. We're looking at a highly coordinated drone campaign.
Part 1. E-commerce meets the front line. So, when these strikes first made the news, a lot of analysts kind of brushed them off. They thought, okay, this is probably just tit-for-tat retaliation for strikes on Ukrainian postal depots. But digging into the source data, the reality is so much deeper and way more strategic than that. We're literally watching the exact point where everyday e-commerce collides with the front line. To really make sense of this, you have to understand the target. Wildberries isn't just your average online store. It is Russia's absolutely largest online marketplace. And to pull off that scale, it runs an enormous, highly centralized warehousing and distribution network across the entire country. On paper, sure, it's a massive civilian e-commerce footprint moving consumer goods to everyday folks, but a network with that sheer size and efficiency, that gives it a really potent logistical capability that goes way beyond delivering, household items.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it defines the bridge between civilian commerce and military operations. It all comes down to what we call dual-use materials. Basically, these are goods and equipment originally designed for totally normal commercial applications, but they are incredibly valuable for military purposes too. When a logistics network gets so good that it can move millions of these items with lightning speed, that line between a civilian e-commerce platform and a military supply chain doesn't just blur, it pretty much vanishes.
Seriously, just imagine what's actually flowing through this network on any given day. We are not just talking about clothes and books here. The platform actively takes orders and drops critical supplies straight to Russian military positions. It's kind of surreal to think about, a modern military machine essentially relying on the equivalent of Amazon Prime for frontline logistics. We're talking radios, high-tech communications gear, body armor, drone components, general electronics. Even sanctioned goods that are super hard to get anywhere else are moving through these hubs. And on top of that, you've got volunteer aid destined directly for the troops moving right through this supposedly civilian infrastructure. Russian troops and defense manufacturers have essentially built a huge reliance on this seamless, centralized network to get what they need.
Part 2. Dismantling the logistics network. Recognizing that heavy reliance completely flips how we have to view these drone strikes, we need to stop looking at them as just isolated warehouse fires and start looking at the broader Ukrainian strategic objective at play. Because this objective is incredibly calculated. It's not about revenge, it is about systematically dismantling the exact networks that connect civilian commerce with military supply. The strikes are actively targeting the storage centers, the sorting hubs, the key transport nodes. Because Russia leans so heavily on these massive centralized warehouses, Ukraine is trying to flip that script. They want to turn a massive logistical strength into a crippling vulnerability, taking them out one by one.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of the degradation we're seeing right now. Out of roughly 20 critical logistics hubs, and we're talking huge places, larger than 50,000 square meters, located in European Russia, 4 of them have already been struck.
That is roughly 20% of these massive infrastructure hubs, either damaged or totally destroyed. It just goes to show exactly how methodical this campaign really is, just working its way through the most vital nodes in the whole network.
To put that into an even sharper perspective, let's talk about this number, 25%. Estimates actually suggest that Wildberries alone may have lost around 1/4 of its total storage capacity because of these strikes. Because of this, Moscow and the surrounding region have essentially lost a massive chunk of their entire logistical capacity. So this isn't just some minor disruption. We're talking about a severe crippling of regional logistics.
And taking out these huge facilities sets off a really devastating chain reaction. Think of it like a logistics domino effect. When a major hub goes down, all that displaced cargo doesn't just vanish into thin air, right? It has to go somewhere. So it shifts over to secondary platforms like Ozon, which is Russia's second largest marketplace, or the Russian post facilities. But here's the catch. Pushing all that heavy cargo traffic and military supply into those secondary facilities just paints a giant target on their backs. They become the next logical targets. Plus, pushing all that extra volume down the chain totally overloads the smaller sorting centers, delays everyday deliveries, and pushes the entire regional distribution system right to the edge of total paralysis.
Part 3. The Air Defense Dilemma. So it begs the question, right? If these massive warehouses are so absolutely critical to both the everyday economy and the military supply chain, why on earth are they being left so exposed to long-range drones in the first place? Well, to answer that, we have to look at a massive strategic dilemma currently facing Moscow, and it all ties back to this number, 40%. Before this whole warehouse campaign even started, previous long-range Ukrainian strikes successfully knocked out roughly 40% of Russian oil refining capacity. That was a huge blow. It triggered an absolute nationwide fuel crisis. It was a massive economic emergency that forced leadership into a corner, making them choose exactly what they were going to defend. So, the crucial point is this agonizing strategic trade-off. Over on side A, you have the oil refineries. Because of that severe fuel crisis, Moscow had to relocate many of its remaining air defense systems just to protect that vital energy sector, but you obviously can't protect everything. So over on side B, you have the logistics terminals, the factories, the warehouses. By choosing to secure the oil and the energy revenue, they've left their critical e-commerce and supply chain hubs completely exposed. They are, as the source points out, basically sitting ducks for incoming drones.
Part 4. Economic fallout and civilian cost.
Opening up this new front against logistics infrastructure is way more than just a military headache. It's a full-blown economic earthquake. This military reality is bleeding directly into civilian life. So let's zoom out a bit and look at the macro-level impact this has on everyday Russian citizens and the wider economy. 1 billion euros. That is an absolutely staggering number. It's the estimated financial loss for merchants resulting from the destruction of just 2 of those major Wildberries warehouses. When a facility of that size burns to the ground, the inventory inside it represents the literal livelihoods of thousands of people, just evaporating in a matter of hours.
But here is where it gets truly devastating for the average person. You might logically assume that a giant mega-corporation would just absorb a billion-euro loss like that, right? Well, actually, according to the source, recently adjusted Wildberries contract terms explicitly exclude liability for losses caused by drone or missile attacks. Let that sink in. This means that ordinary, everyday people who use the platform as independent sellers are entirely footing the bill. It's the small online merchants who are paying out of pocket for the destruction of these massive facilities.
And pushing that financial burden downward creates a huge ripple effect on everyday life. Every single time a strike is successful, it drives up insurance costs, it forces companies to awkwardly try and disperse their goods into smaller locations, you end up with delayed parcels across the entire country, completely wiped out inventories, and as a direct result, small businesses just failing left and right. And inevitably, that leads to widespread price increases for everyone else at the checkout. Take all of that, mix it with those ongoing fuel shortages we talked about, and you have a recipe for spiking public anxiety nationwide. The massive costs of sustaining this war effort is actively spreading right onto the shoulders of the everyday civilian population.
Ultimately, despite whatever official promises might be made on TV about economic stability, the reality outlined in the source material is pretty stark. The logistical foundations of normal life are actively collapsing right alongside the military supply system. These two systems have just become so intertwined, so tangled up together, that you literally cannot dismantle one without deeply fracturing the other. Everyday economic stability isn't just stressed, it is simply unraveling.
Which leaves us with this final, really vital question to ponder. Can everyday economic life even survive when civilian supply chains become primary military targets? When the warehouse delivering your household goods is the exact same one delivering body armor to the front line, the consequences obviously reach far, far beyond the battlefield. It completely reshapes how we have to understand modern logistics in a time of conflict. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a clearer perspective on such a complex and evolving issue.